Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If we're still looking for seats, there's a couple of, there's some empty seats down here to my left, your right. Okay. Let me start out by saying thank you for everyone coming today. This is an amazing thing to see 400 people in a room like this for an important event. Today is I believe this is our 7th version of our joint outreach for strategic trade management, co-sponsored by the US government and the Japanese Ministry of Economic Trade and Industry. Thank you so much for doing that. We have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to keep this part of it very brief. The only thing I ask, if you have a cell phone, please turn it to silent, vibrate, or something other than ring, because we have a lot of people to come up and give you a lot of information, and we want you to have the best opportunity to see it. So I'm going to start off by introducing our Chargé d'Affaires, Mr. Rafiq Mansour. Mr. Mansour recently arrived in Singapore back in, I believe it was July, right, sir? And he has taken over the leadership of the U.S. Embassy here. From 2014 to 2016, he's the Senior Deputy Director for Public Diplomacy in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, helping lead PD efforts, policy, and resources in 50 countries. Other assignments include Public Affairs Officer in Libya and Algeria, Cultural Counselor in Iraq and France, Political Officer in Italy, and Political Economic Officer in Russia. He started his foreign service career as Vice Consul in Haiti. Mr. Mansour is a recipient of numerous awards from the Department of State. He is also the runner-up for the 2009 Edward Murrow Award of Excellence in Public Diplomacy for exemplary use of soft power in combating violent extremists in Algeria. He's got his Bachelor of Science in Biology and a Bachelor of Arts in French Literature from the University of California, Irvine, by the way, my home state. He received his master's from the National Security Strategy from the National War College. He speaks Arabic, Russian, French, Italian, and Creole. Mr. Mansour.
With a degree in biology and French literature, you see how ill-prepared I am for this career. Good morning, everybody. On behalf of the US government, including our embassy in Singapore and our colleagues from Washington, D.C., it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you here this morning to the 7th Joint Industry Outreach on Strategic Trade Management. A very special thank you to Singapore Customs and Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry for co-sponsoring this year's event with us. This year marks the 3rd year in a row this has been a tri-sponsored event and truly shows how important these topics are and the impact that they can have. I would like to acknowledge the presence of some very distinguished guests today. Deputy Director General Lim from Singapore Customs, Director Kiyoki from the Japan's METI, Deputy Director Varavitia from the Department of Foreign Trade in Thailand, Mr. Benjamin Honey, Australian Border Force, Australian Embassy Jakarta, Justin Herrera from the Strategic Trade Office in the Philippines, and Mr. Ridzuyan Alias from the Ministry of International Trade and Industry in Malaysia. Thank you all very much for your presence here and for your partnership in this seminar. Thank you also to my colleagues who have traveled from Washington, D.C. Mr. Alexander Lopez from the Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Security, and Mr. Samuel Phelps from the Department of Treasury, Office of Foreign Assets Control, for their willingness to share your expertise with us today. Also, I would like to thank both the Department of State's Export Control and Related Border Security (EXBIS) program and the Department of Energy International Non-Proliferation Export Control Program for also partnering with us today. XBIS is a Department of State non-proliferation program that recognizes the importance of both government and private sector in achieving desired non-proliferation outcomes in the region. The role that manufacturers, exporters, brokers, freight forwarder, the financial industry play as a first line of defense against proliferation. XBIS cooperates closely with various US and foreign governmental agencies, such as these here today, as well as non-governmental institutions in building sustainable strategic trade systems. Our Department of Energy provides direct training to licensing officials and technical experts in partner countries to conduct technical proliferation risk analysis of dual-use export licenses. Energy also assists in developing an enterprise outreach strategy to ensure key industries are aware of export control laws and regulations. These profound partnerships yield great results, as is evident in today's turnout of over 400 participants and 3 panels of experts. As we work together to face an ever-evolving and more dangerous geopolitical environment, we need to remain in close contact about what we are seeing and how we can work together. Outreach events such as this not only serve to educate us, but also to form strong networks to which we can go for advice and share vital information. As you see from today's agenda, you have representatives from 7 different countries and 3 compliance experts from large global companies ready to share their expertise with you today. When it comes to managing strategic trade, government and industries each have specific responsibilities. Governments play a critical role to publish clear, well-defined regulations and work together with other partner governments around the world to share information and strengthen cooperation. As recent passages of strategic trade laws in the region has shown, the Philippines implementing and now Thailand introducing these laws, the effort of governments to monitor the movement of strategic goods and preventing those who would do us harm from receiving these goods is indeed increasing. Industry plays an equally important role by creating and implementing compliance programs. This includes understanding export control and strategic trade laws, doing the necessary due diligence on all customers, and conducting self-audits to ensure these programs are effective. Industry also has the responsibility to notify someone when they believe there is a possible proliferation or diversion of goods. Recent events have shown just how destabilizing this technology can be. We too have seen that Iran has openly confirmed it is moving forward with advanced centrifuge research and development work in non-performance of the nuclear deal. With this, President Trump made clear we will continue imposing maximum pressure on the Iranian regime until it ceases its destabilizing activities and negotiates a comprehensive deal. We know that strategic goods are falling into dangerous hands on a regular basis. Our challenge is to be stronger, more united, and more informed than the criminals, terrorists, and regimes who would do us harm. Today is an opportunity for our smallest companies to meet some of the largest companies in the world and hear how they built their compliance programs at no cost other than their time. You, the exporting community, are our eyes and ears. You are the ones who receive the suspicious inquiries, whose Reputation is most damaged when items get diverted, and who spend hard-earned profits on compliance programs while your competitors may not. We must work together to protect our collective national security. I wish you all a very productive seminar today and hope you depart with the partnerships, networks, and information to make your company, your government, and our world a safer place. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Next, it is my great honor to introduce Director Joji Kioki, who's the Director of Office of International Affairs for Security Export Control, Trade Control Department, Trade and Economic Cooperation Bureau for the Ministry of Economic Trade and Industry in Japan. Mr. Kioki.
Good morning, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. First, let me introduce myself. I am Joji Koike. I serve as the Director of the Office of International Affairs for Security Export Control in the Ministry of Economy and Trade and Industry in Japan. And it's my great honor to be able to participate in such a distinguished conference with you. And also, on behalf of the Japanese government, Ministry of Trade and Industry, as the honor to be able to co-host this joint industry outreach seminar on strategic trade management in 2019 here in Singapore, together with the United States EXPS, the Department of State, and with the Singapore Customs Government of Singapore. Thank you very much. And it is also my pleasure to come here in Singapore since I was actually stationed and worked in Singapore for 4 years until July last year. So in a sense, I'm coming back to my second home country. So it is such a great pleasure for myself. And it is also my pleasure that for the interest shown to the seminar from various sectors engaged in trade of sensitive goods and others. It goes without saying about the importance of appropriately implementing a strategic export management in order to avoid sensitive goods and technologies to go into the hands of the wrong people, trying to develop weapons of mass destruction and other arms. Such risk management is a prerequisite for free trade, as all of you know. Activities by proliferation to procure sensitive goods and technologies are becoming more and more sophisticated and complex, which means that we need to know what implications does this have on private sectors and others. Also, in addition to the traditional strategic export control, the importance of strategic linkage of multiple policy means to counter these complex procurement activities is growing ever. And these may include ITT controls in academic areas, universities, for example, countering proliferation financing, strengthening of investment screening, and others. I think these issues may be discussed later today. And turning to this as Asia and ASEAN region, I would like to point out that this is one of the most fast-growing regions with its industrial structure becoming more and more sophisticated. Together with the fact that here in Singapore is serving as one of the hub in Asia in terms of goods, trade, and the manufacturing system, makes this region, including ASEAN, a target for procurement of sensitive technologies. In that regard, I look forward to listen today how some of our ASEAN country colleagues, such as Thailand and Philippines, are making best efforts with regard to implementing strategic trade management, which leads to reinforcing our collective efforts to contain illegal proliferation activities. Needless to say, private sector's compliance is a cornerstone of effective establishment and implementation of strategic export management. And I look forward on the discussion of the best practices. And I'm sure that the audience, the participants here are greatly, have a knowledge and a lot of questions. And I believe that these questions will make this seminar even more valuable. So in that regard, today's seminar includes a number of interesting programs, and it is my wish that distinguished participants can make use of presentations discussion in order to strengthen strategic export control in your companies, in your organization, etc. Thank you very much.
Now, again, it gives me great pleasure and it's a great honor to introduce Mr. Lim Leong, the Deputy Director General of Singapore Customs. Mr. Lim is currently the Deputy Director General, Corporate and Facilitation. As this, he oversees the corporate division as well as the trade division in Singapore Customs. He is also covering the role of Assistant Director General for Trade. As covering this role, he directly oversees all custom matters relating to trade facilitation, regulations, and supply chain security, so as to make trade easy, fair, and secure. Mr. Lim.
Morning, everyone. Good to see all of you again, friends, colleagues, friends from overseas who flew in from far places. Mr. Rafiq Masood, Charter Affairs, Embassy of the United States. Mr. Joji Koke, Director of Security Export Control Administration in Ministry of Trade Industry in Japan, METI in short. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. First, thanks for taking time off your busy schedule to attend today's event. Some of you will probably have been attending this event for many years, like myself. So it's not new to see me on the stage. The first two speakers here on me have very stressed the importance of the roles that companies play, as well as the importance of ensuring the effective export control regime. Export control is not very much, it's an international event, it's not a domestic control. The chain is as strong as the weakest link. So it's very important that the regulators, the industries, and the countries around us or in the global region enforce or have a robust export control regime. That's the reason why we are here, of course. Of course, I'm pleased to see a huge turnout, but as usual, I'm apologetic that we could not entertain more requests than what the size of the hall could contain. I was speaking earlier to some of my US friends that probably we can see next year whether we can hold somewhere else as usual. But like last year, we had we do a video conference, it's a video recording. So any of colleagues or people, companies or friends who couldn't attend could at least have access to the video. And if there's any questions from the speeches, from the discussion, I think they can email to us or our colleagues from overseas, and then they can answer the replies by email, etc. Trade compliance in terms of export control, I think, is not a simple affair, as I say. It's not a simple affair like paying your duty and taxes. Firstly, the extent of things that's under control is immense. The items, technologies behind is not simple. You need to have some expert knowledge, and there's some advice, and you have detailed information to classify the items to see whether they are under export control. And every year, the list of items changes. Some things will be really controlled, some things will be decontrolled. At the same time, I think it evolved evolving technology in both various sectors, or to introduce new products. And often and not, all companies are dealing with new technologies, new products. And we will constantly ask ourselves whether those items are under export control. Because I don't think any company here will wish to be non-compliant. So I think the export control regime, that's important. But it means also at your end, when you have an internal compliance program, your staff, yourself, your management need to know what is under control, way before even you sign a contract with any company overseas. We often advise companies to come to us, Singapore Customs, seek early advice before you ink a contract with a company overseas. Because we have encountered situations whereby a company sign a contract with someone, and commercially they are obliged then to supply certain product to certain countries or certain companies. And later on they discovered that, they couldn't get export permit from customs. And then of course there are commercial implications of the company. So of course, if you can, you already know who you want to sell to, you know the end use of the item, you know the specs of the item you should have. Do consult us early if you could. At least get some early indication so that you are not affected if there's a change in regulations, or not change in regulations, but it's very if you can't get a spot permit out of the country. Other than that, I think we'll highlight basically two key trends that are still very much affecting the company as well as the whole export control regime. One, of course, is the advent of new technologies, or not new technologies per se, but increasingly new technologies being used, like your 3D manufacturing, biotechnology research area, etc., which increasingly most companies are dealing with, and all these new technologies pose a certain risk, as well as questions in terms of whether they're controlled, in terms of how you can control it. For example, in the area of 3D printing, with 3D printing, companies could actually then print their items, small items, highly specialized items with special materials on site in their own premises. You don't have to then transport the item cross-border. So that makes certain challenges in terms of export control regime, in terms of how you control the item per se. You probably need to control the technology, but controlling technology is more sophisticated than controlling a physical product. And that itself, I think, brings challenges to various parties as well. With e-commerce now becoming more prevalent, not in the B2C space, but also in the B2B space, it makes tracking items, small parcels, things that are sent through postal regime, difficult. Because if you know you send an item via post, you go to the post office, you don't fill out an export permit. You just write something down manually on the green sticker, and there it goes through the postal regime. So postal regime itself poses a challenge in terms of control as well. Not just for the export control regime, but also in the tax and revenue regime as well, where normal trade declarations permits are not required when you send items through the post. So that's something that we also are cognizant of, pay attention to, and see whether what new regulation may need to be put in place to address such risks. Second trend, I think, is the change in the regulations per se. Increasingly, as what my colleague, Mr. Masu, earlier said, in terms of the Iranian threats, and of course the TPRQ threats, they are there. It's not going away yet. I can read in the media. This trend also poses a change in some of the regulations you see that's imposed by some countries. But some countries, they do their risk management, they deem that certain of their products are higher risk to be exported to certain countries. They may then impose certain regulations or may do things differently. So I think companies need to be wary, to know what are the things that are under control when things are being shipped. Reason why? Because many of countries here do buy products from the different major countries. The products are not from Singapore. They are of other countries' origin, but may be shipped through Singapore, and then you may buy and sell and send to someone else, without knowing whether they are controlled by the third-party country to another country. So these are things I think is good to know. I'm sure you are aware of it, but that's why we also have speakers from different regions, different countries, to answer any queries you have in terms of procedures, in terms of what is controlled and is not controlled, so that you at least know how can you be compliant. Okay. I think with that, for our side, in terms of how Singapore has done over the last year, I think many of you should be familiar, but my colleague will share a bit more later. But briefly, the last 12 months, we have updated our new export control list to keep in line with the Wasana changes, the EU export control list. such that in terms of the export control regime, the list of items we regulate in Singapore are aligned with international trends. Our own transit and transshipment list, we also have updated it, put in new products because of the change in the risk of certain products that's traded in the region. We heard some feedback from the industry also in terms of how end user statement could be fine-tuned to facilitate business. We have done that. So these are some of the changes we've done over the years, both in terms of making the export control regime in Singapore more robust, but also to make it more trade facilitative. It's a fine balance between both. So my colleague will share later on these details. As shared by earlier two speakers, we have many speakers, experts from the region. And we also have our partners from Thailand and the Philippines to hear. In fact, we joyfully welcome and are encouraged by Thailand and Philippines in introducing export control regime in time to come. Because as I said earlier, supply chain is as strong as the weakest link. So it's good that any countries in the region who are also trading in the same items to have a robust export control regime. Singapore, our side, we are always there ready to share with them. Of course, invite them to events like this to share with the companies in terms of what they do in their countries so they can be aware of what the changes around here. Okay. Last but not least, I think I wish everyone here a fruitful event. You notice that this year agenda is slightly different, the format. We have more panel sessions rather than presentation style. This is arising from the feedback from last year where many people, attendees, fed back to us that panel discussions are more useful, where you can shoot questions or you can fire questions. And it's a much lively session. So I hope that is useful. Do give us your feedback in terms of how we can do things better next year. And thank you very much for your time here. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to switch for a sec. Hold on. For those that know me and have seen me do this a few times, I don't like to stand behind that. I like to walk. There we go. I like to walk when I talk. Okay, so let's cover a little bit about today's agenda. First of all, let me stop and CDA, thank you so much. Deputy Director Lim, thank you. Director Kyoki, thank you so much for your remarks. I think it kind of sets up what we're going to be doing today. You heard Deputy Director Lim talk about the feedback form. That is why we changed the process from presenters on PowerPoints to this panel style. Let us know if there's something else you want or something you want, a different kind, a different flavor, a different thing. Let us know because this event isn't going away. And as you can see, it gets bigger every year. So by a show of hands, how many of this is your first event? First one of these? Wow, about 40%. How many of you have been here 3 times or more? Yep, this is my 4th and my last. So I do want to cut, as we say in America, foot stomp a couple of different things that were said. Number 1, the feedback form. Let's make sure we fill out our feedback form. I think there'll be a QR code that you can scan in and do it. We all have our cell phones. Take the time to do that because it really does matter to us. Because when we go back to our bosses to ask for money to do this and keep this event free, that's how we're able to do it. Second of all, take the time to talk to the people at your table if you don't know them. Find out who they are, what they do, why they're here. And if you know everybody at your table, like I see a couple of company-based tables in the room, stretch out. Go talk to somebody. Take this opportunity. This is a chance for you to sit in front of people that you've never met before, that are experts in the field of compliance, government regulations. Maybe we have somebody from the Office of Foreign Assets Control here to talk about some of the Iranian sanctions, some of the DPRK sanctions. Take the time to come up and talk to him and say, hey, this is who I am, this is what I do. I have some questions because he's an expert. Whether it's BIS, whether it's Singapore Customs, whether it's Japan, whether it's Chinese export controls with Mr. Johnny, whether it's the new Thai law going into effect, the Philippines law. Ask, ask, ask. This is your chance. With that, let's get into our first panel. The first panel is going to be, hold on, I set it up here and I said I wasn't going to do that. No, it's over here. Okay. Let me introduce Alvin Tok. He is the head of the Strategic Trade and Security for Singapore Customs. He is currently the head of the Trade Strategy and Security branch of the Trade Division, Singapore Customs. This branch supports Trade Division in providing public input and strategic planning on customs trade matters, including strategic goods, the UNSC resolutions, supply chain security, and serves as a key liaison for foreign and local agencies on these matters. Alvin? So what Alvin's going to do is Alvin's going to introduce to the panel to you. We have 4 panelists, and this is your opportunity to ask questions. They're going to give a little bit of intro, a little bit of talk about what they are, or who they are, what they do, and then I expect lots of questions from my audience today. If those that have seen me here, I am not afraid to say, what do you think? With a microphone. We have a couple of people that are going to be walking around with microphones. Raise your hand. Take the time to ask a question. Okay, Alvin.
Thank you, Scott. And a very good morning to everyone. Today, the first panel discussion we have with us 4 experts. Benjamin, can I have the expert on stage? Benjamin from Australia Border Force, Joji Koike from Japan, Alexander Lopes from USA, Corey Phelps from USA as well. Please take a seat. I'll let the experts have a short introduction of themselves when they take the stage. Our first speaker for the first panel is Benjamin Honey. He's the acting councillor of the Australian Border Force. Benjamin, please.
Good morning. It's lovely to be here today, and I just want to acknowledge the organisers, the opportunity for Australia to come and present at something like this is very important. My name is Benjamin Honey. I'm the Acting Councillor for Australian Border Force, and I'm based in Jakarta at the Australian Embassy, but I cover Singapore, Indonesia and Timor-Leste, and work very closely with the border authorities in all of those countries. It goes without saying that Australia is a strong supporter of international efforts to prevent the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Is there a clicker or...
Can I have a technical support?
Yeah, next slide please. Within Australia's effort, Australian Border Force is the primary border enforcement agency, and we work closely with a number of other agencies to ensure that Australia is not engaged in activities. Sorry. This one? Thank you. So we're working very closely with other agencies in Australia to ensure that Australia is not engaged in activities that may contribute to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. The way that we do this is through robust export controls. Our export control policies and legislations reflect our government's commitment to this. It makes me very nervous when I hear the term expert, because for Australia, this is a whole of government effort. There is not one single entity that is managing the challenge of counter-proliferation and weapons of mass destruction. It can be put into a general category when we look at the way that we deal with this challenge. We look at policy, intelligence, enforcement, but most importantly, it's interagency cooperation and communication. So this slide, and I apologise, the quality isn't fantastic, but it just shows you some of the agencies who are actually involved. Our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is the lead agency in terms of coordination of Australia's counter-proliferation efforts. But in that lead role, it needs to be acknowledged that our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is very reliant on those other agencies who are leading on intelligence, enforcement and investigations. Our Department of Defence is also a key policy agency for defence and dual-use goods. So Department of Defence is the experts to complete the evaluation within permit issuing agencies. Australian Border Force refers exporter information and looks for the Department of Defence as the technical experts for assessment. Department of Defence provides Australian Border Force formal advice around whether a permit is required for export. So when you come to the Australian Border Force and you make an inquiry with us, we would generally expect to have a response back within about 2 days. However, sometimes it can be longer. The permit application process, however, can take up to 35 days. And again, sometimes longer depending on the complexity of the goods. In the whole of government effort, Australian Border Force can work closely with you to make sure that you're getting the advice that you need, working with the Department of Defence and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Department of Defence also facilitates a quarterly meeting within the whole of government effort, which assists in actually discussing more complex permit issuing arrangements. So as I said, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is our lead agency around counter-proliferation. I think I've already said enough that the effort in Australia is a whole of government. There are key activities in that inter-agency cooperation, intergovernment cooperation. We work through processes of monitoring export activity by a company, intervening with exports, conducting outreach visits, so education, and information sessions around permits and requirements. For Australian Border Force, we use intelligence products to identify high-risk border transactions. One of the areas that I wanted to speak to today very quickly was around the change in Australia, the establishment of the Australian Border Force, and more broadly, the establishment of the Department of Home Affairs, the portfolio. So you can see our mission and our vision. You can see that the Australian Border Force is Australia's customs and Australia's immigration service. We continue in the regulatory arrangements on behalf of the Australian government. Just to give you the context of where Australian Border Force fits into the portfolio, you can see that, like other law enforcement agencies, the Australian Federal Police being one, the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission being another, we sit in a single ministerial portfolio, with Home Affairs bringing together federal law enforcement, national and transport security, criminal justice, emergency management, multicultural affairs, settlement services, and immigration and border-related functions. For Australian Border Force, we utilise specialist investigations and enforcement capability. We address national security risks where there's a nexus, movement of goods or a movement of people across the border that's into and out of Australia. Obviously today we're talking about export goods. This just provides an overview of some of the areas that we're focused on in relation to counter-proliferation. Australian Border Force looks at the border as a continuum. We work ahead of the border, at the border, and across the border. We use risk management principles in the way that we deal with all goods, and counter-proliferation goods are no different. The Australian Government requires that goods must be reported to the Australian Border Force before they're taken on board ships or aircraft, and this allows us the opportunity to actually risk assess. Where we find serious criminal motivated export breaches, there is a range of investigative powers available to the Australian Border Force, including the power to search premises with or without warrants. And in certain cases, we work very closely with the Australian Federal Police. So that all sounds very serious. But I think one of the things today that we've already heard is that counter-proliferation is not just about a law enforcement agency imposing the regulation. Australian Border Force and more broadly the Australian Government sees that there's a very important outreach. We need to be working closely with industry through areas such as our Trusted Trader program, through our compliance regime, through education, and there are a number of websites which provide additional information around dual-use goods. We're always happy to take inquiries. One of the keys, I think, when we're dealing with some of these complex issues is if you're not sure, the best thing you can do is ask. At the end of this session, I'll be available. I'm happy to pass over my contact details. Border Watch is just one of our outreach programs. So that does provide some additional information around our website. There's also information from the Department of Defence. Apologies, that hasn't been listed up on the slide. But again, at the end of this session, I'm happy to speak with anyone who is interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. Our next speaker is Joji Koike, Director of International Affairs for Security Export Control, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry of Japan. Joji, please.
Hello once again. And I would like to briefly today, I'd like to have a short explanation of the recent trends of what Japan, especially METI, is doing. And before going into the slides, it's not included in the slides, but a brief explanation of what METI, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, it's really a long name, so I just call it METI. And I think you people know METI, I hope. So METI is the sole authority in Japan with regard to a security export control, or maybe in terms of this seminar, strategic export management. And we are issuing licensing. Of course, we are cooperating with Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Defense in doing so. And our team, the personnel which is engaged in export control, strategic export management in METI is around 120 or 130 people now, among which 40 or 45 people are the export licensing officers. So what other guys in METI are doing, such as me, I'm not a licensing officer per se, but I am among this 130 people. The people who are doing export control, other than export control, is engaging in like policy planning for strategic export management, and some interfaces with international interfaces, which I am leading. For example, what I am doing is, there are two. Since Japan's export control is also based on international agreed control lists in principle, what our team is doing is to have some kind of talks or negotiation with international export control regimes such as WASANA or MTCR, Australia Group, or Nuclear Supply Group. So that's among my team's tasks, to go there, talk, and discuss, and contribute to some certain agreement, bring it back, and then pass it to our legal. There's another team which is in charge of putting that international agreement into domestic laws and regulations, etc., etc. And my other task is related to outreach, so centered on Asia or Southeast Asia nations. My work is dealing with planning of such outreach activities centered on Asia, and to have a collaborative approach in order to have a more rigid strategic export management in this region, and that's how it works. And of course, based on this domestic laws and regulations, our law is our export control is actually based on international agreement, and we have certain enforcement teams also, and that makes up of in total 130 people. So I won't go into the details of what METI is doing in terms of export control. Rather, I would like to focus on a more approach of what Japan, METI, is doing in order to strengthen this strategic export management. So this is a kind of a notion table of what we are, what we have in mind in order to go through this export control. And I just, in my opening remarks, I just touched upon a procurement activity is becoming more and more complex. And what's that eventually? And if you can take a look at the left side, the procurement activities by these illegal persons or concerned countries are mainly concentrated on goods trade and technology transfer through companies. And of course, there are other means. However, the current situation, if you look at the right side, in addition to this goods trade or technology transfer, there are more and more focus is becoming on investment. What is investment? To invest on manufacturing companies or technology companies which have critical technology, which produce sensitive goods, and to acquire, to get access to that. That is becoming more and more a critical phenomenon. And the other one is, for example, to get access to universities and get involved in joint research activities and to try to get access to the sensitive technologies and to make use of it in order to develop weapons of mass destruction or other military means. And others, as you can see, is a phenomenon which is getting more and more problematic, such as talent recruiting or like cyber, transferring technologies, acquiring technologies through cyber and others. So against that backdrop, what we are really thinking how to deal with this kind of new trends is, well, there are two pillars. One is to have a good analysis, and the other is to we have to focus on export control. That's the basics, but we need a more holistic approach in order to widen our defense or to have a more capability to cope with this kind of complex trends. Now, talking about analysis, there are two. Know them. What's know them? Analysis of technological development strategic sectors in country of concerns. What the countries of concerns, what the illegal proliferators are actually contemplating, and who are they, and what kind of complex tactics they are actually using. This is one of the most important things that for the strategic export management to do. Well, there are many trends of using front companies, and there are entities which are actually connected eventually with military or some very complex methods. So we have to know them. And together with that, we have to know ourselves. What kind of sensitive goods and technologies are actually being developed and produced inside us? That is really an important task. And it might be easy to have some kind of information if it's a very big company, but as you all know, the world is not only made up of big companies. There are SMEs which plays a very, very critical part, but some of them are known, some of them are not. We need to know what kind of technologies, especially the sensitive ones, are being, who are producing it. And more focus is, of course, just as I said, on academy, universities, etc. So we have to know ourselves. If we know ourselves, then we can make further analysis. We can focus our efforts on that specific firm's organization in order to conduct an outreach. Now, the latter part is that that's what I said. We have this traditional export control or strategic export management, together with mergers and acquisitions, how we are going to cope with this investment activities and to get access through these kind of mergers and acquisitions. And the red one is how we can actually cope with this trend of having a joint research and trying to use that as a means, illegal means to develop weapons of mass destruction, etc. So these are the four kind of a holistic approach that we are about to take, or we are already taking, but we're going to strengthen. Now, I have an opportunity later to explain about this ITT control. So I will explain some of the examples, what we are doing about investment screening. Well, this is the investment screening program which Japan is taking. if a foreign investor is investing on certain sectors, a prior notification is needed, and then we are going to investigate and to look into that. And some may be approved. I mean, most of the cases are going to be approved in reality. But some of them may pose certain risk. So in that case, we need a mitigation program to set some kind of conditions in order to approve such kind of applications for foreign investors. And some goes to denial, which may be a very, very small portion in reality. So what is the actual sectoral coverage required for prior notification for investment? Well, there are such like weapons, airplanes, etc., etc. And if you look at the last line, all listed items in export control regimes, that means that since 2017, we had a law amendment of law on investment. So this means that if there is an agreed list of controlled export control list, those companies which develop and manufacture such goods which are controlled, and those who apply to invest in those strategic companies needs to go through prior notification. So this is eventually a kind of a linkage between strategic export management and investment. This eventually shows one of the examples of a holistic or collaborative approach. And this is the latest amendment of regulations on investment prior notification. We have just, in May this year, we've added cyber-related manufacturers as a target for prior notification. So if a foreign investor tries to invest in Japanese companies which are somewhat related to cyber, they need to go through prior notification if they are going to acquire more than 10% of the stocks. So these are the actual list of what is cyber-related companies like integrated circuits, semiconductors, etc., etc. And on top of that, I could not right now mention very precisely, but what the Japanese government is contemplating is maybe there is further ways to strengthen this investment screening, and I think this is under discussion right now. So, in short, I would like to stress that, just as I explained, including this inward FDI screening program, a more holistic approach is actually necessary in order to counter the complexity of proliferation activities. And later I will touch on ITT controls in this section. So, in any case, apologies for not making a comprehensive export control, what else we are doing, but just focusing on recent trends. But if you have questions, I would be really glad to answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joji. Our next speaker, Alexander Lopes, Director from the Office of Non-Proliferation Treaty Compliance from the U.S. Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Security. We are trying to get the slides for Alex. Please give us a while. Maybe Alex can give some self-introduction.
Sure. Well, it's a pleasure to be back here today. Tech had to remind me that I'd been here several times before. But it's always a pleasure to see the ever-growing crowd. I think I've been doing these seminars since I started this position. I work at the Bureau of Industry and Security at the Department of Commerce in Washington, D.C. I'm the director for the Office of Non-Proliferation and Treaty Compliance. In short, my office is responsible for the dual-use licensing of those items that we control for nuclear reasons, the Nuclear Suppliers Group dual use list, the Missile Technology Control Regime, and the Australia Group for those items we control for chemical and biological reasons. And I also have a division that handles our foreign policy controls that are controls related to exports to sanctioned and embargoed countries. You'll hear from Corey later. We sort of have a dual role with our Department of Treasury. But that's my job in a nutshell. I was trying to recall some of the things I presented on before, and I do really want to minimize the time up here so we can have some panel discussion. But as I think we all know, strategic trade controls is very dynamic. So when I think back of the presentations I've made in the past, it is kind of a litany of the challenges that we face as export compliance experts, export licensing experts. In the past, I've given presentations on catch-all, one of the challenges of our jobs. Not so much those strategic goods, but those goods that aren't on any control lists, but are maybe being used for bad reasons. The challenge that we all face here in Singapore, the challenge of transit or transshipment, or those items that are going through our ports. Intangible technology transfers, which we'll have a presentation on later today. One of the challenges that we're facing now, which I'd like to focus on with my brief 5 or 10 minutes, is the challenge of emerging technologies. You know, when we take a look at strategic controls, we're typically looking in the rearview mirror. We have an item that we know might be have a dual nuclear use, a dual missile use, a dual chemical or biological from a WMD perspective, a dual conventional use. We're always looking in the rearview mirror. We're looking at those tangible items and the technologies surrounding those technology items that might be a proliferation risk or a dual-use conventional risk. The challenge of looking forward when you might not have a thing, you might not have that tangible thing yet. It might be something we're looking at in a lab, in a university lab, in a government laboratory. Some future thing. It's we're finding one of the most challenging efforts that at least I've faced in the number of years that I've been doing strategic trade control. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the emerging technology issue that we're currently facing in identifying emerging technologies that might be a national security or might pose a proliferation concern. So that's what I'm going to focus my presentation on in this opening panel. How many folks in here are in companies that are involved in research and development, just by a show of hands? Okay, so a good number of you are looking for that next product. Well, that's the challenge that we all face with emerging technology. So this is just a couple bullet points of the things that I hope to cover today. I think when I was here last year, I talked about our Export Control Reform Act, which was passed by our Congress last August of 2018, which renewed our Export Administration Act, which had expired in the early 90s, which was passed in 1979, which goes to the challenge of getting that one pillar, statutory or statutory authority for your implementing regulations. Well, in the case of emerging technology, our Export Control Reform Act provided some specific objectives for the Department of Commerce in identifying emerging technology that might pose a national security concern. I'll talk a little bit about a process that we've had in place for about the last 10 years, the 521 process, which is a process that we currently have in our regulations to identify or to control emerging technologies that have been identified either by another government agency or by someone in the private sector. And you've heard the term whole of government effort. Well, certainly this effort involves all agencies in the United States government, whether it's the Department of Energy and their laboratories, the Department of Defense and their laboratories, and other government agencies that are certainly involved in developing new technologies. Well, this is the relevant section of the Export Control Reform Act that tasks the Department of Commerce to establish a process, an interagency process, to identify both emerging technologies and foundational technologies that might pose a national security concern. And in identifying those technologies, placing appropriate controls on those technologies. Now, what are those appropriate controls? You know, historically, we look at list-based controls where you're controlling items based on certain technical parameters, whether that might be a power level, a purity level, a frequency range. Is that how we control emerging technologies? Is that how we control foundational technologies? What are foundational technologies? I mean, this is a whole universe of technology that we're looking at. How do we look at those technologies? What kind of processes do we put in place? A continuing process to identify these technologies. You've heard the term industry outreach, industry participation in strategic trade controls. The one thing the Export Control Reform Act was actually provided a requirement for an emerging technology advisory committee. What's the role of that advisory committee? We currently have 7 other advisory committees along industry sectors. Certainly those industry sectors, those advisory committees that are already in place, a machine tool advisory committee, a transportation advisory committee on those aerospace, commercial space issues. Already in place, already actively involved in helping us identify those technologies. How are we informed in identifying technologies of concern? The Export Control Reform Act said we need to look at publicly available information. Look at that kind of information that might be classified, that might be sourced by our intelligence community. You heard in the previous presentation the issue of foreign investment. Where are foreign companies investing in particular in the United States? What technologies are they investing in? What future technologies are they investing in? So certainly foreign investment both in the United States and joint ventures offshore are a particular source of identifying those emerging technologies. And of course, industry input, whether it's the new Emerging Technology Advisory Committee or those advisory committees that are currently in place. ECRA also tasks us to take into account the development of emerging technologies in foreign countries. Certainly, we don't want to place or stymie the development of emerging technologies. One of the things I'd just like to mention, sort of as an aside, that I've mentioned in previous presentations, is that whatever we do, we want to make sure that we don't harm the ability for academia, for government laboratories to do their research in leading edge technologies. ECRA requires us to take a look before we impose those controls on determining what effect those export controls might have on further development of those technologies. And finally, are we able to identify a proliferation risk? Are we able to identify a national security risk that those technologies might cause? Now, in November of last year, we published an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. And what we did was we identified 14 technology areas, and frankly, these technology areas were provided by our Department of Defense. But 14 technology areas that caused some concern with our industries. As you can see by this list of technologies, they're rather broad. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, advanced computing, additive manufacturing, very broad areas. For those of you familiar with strategic trade controls, when we establish a control, they're rather narrow controls. And that is really the objective of this emerging technology process, is to identify those slices of these broad technologies that we're able to control. And therein lies the challenge. We received over 200 comments. Just another example of getting our industry and our private sector involved in the process. Those comments will be of significant help in moving forward with this process. Now, what are we doing? At the Department of Commerce, we've established these small working groups, or these small teams, consisting of subject matter experts. In my particular office, we've created teams responsible for the biotechnology area, for the robotics area, for the additive manufacturing. In Tech's opening remarks, he mentioned a couple of those emerging technologies: 3D printing, advanced materials. We talk about the whole of government approach. Our National Security Council has created an export control policy committee deliberation or group comprised of representatives from each of the government agencies, not just the Department of Energy, not just the Department of Defense, not just the Department of State, but whole of government, including representatives from agencies that might have equities in this process. For example, Health and Human Services in the biotech area. So we've got these groups actively involved in trying to identify these slices of technology. With regard to the National Security Council Policy Committee sprint groups, we just completed an in-depth look at artificial intelligence, additive manufacturing, and quantum computing. And we're hopeful that we will be publishing proposed rules with slices of those technologies that we want to put out for public comment to essentially see the viability of placing controls on those items. We've currently created a few more sprint groups that are taking a look at microprocessors, advanced computing, and advanced materials. Certainly, the effectiveness of controls are enhanced by multilateral controls, and certainly part of this process that includes getting public comment from our private sector is also to introduce some of these controls in the multilateral export control regimes. So what are some of the challenges that we're facing? What is considered emerging? What is considered emerging technology? Identification of choke points. For example, with quantum computing, are there certain microchips or microprocessors that are essential to a quantum computer? Are there certain components, for example, cooling components, that might be essential or critical to a quantum computer? With regard to advanced materials, are there certain materials that might be effective in making that next generation explosive with a 3D printer? Another one of the challenges is just the rapid pace at which technology advances. Open source published. Certainly under the US regulations, technology that is in the public domain, technology that results from fundamental research that is published, is not subject to the export administration regulations, is not subject to export controls. And certainly this effort is not intended to inhibit that process. I talked about the advisory committee. We published essentially a recruitment notice almost over a year ago to create this Emerging Technology Advisory Committee. I can say we've gone through the selection process, and we're hopeful to have our first meeting this coming December. But certainly we're looking to this advisory committee that will be comprised of representatives from industry, from government laboratories, from academia, in helping us with this process forward. And this is some of their objectives. We already have a process in place called our 521 process. If those of you that are familiar with our Commerce Control List, we've got a export control classification number dedicated to technologies that are identified as emerging. We've had this in place since, I believe, around 2014. And we have had occasion to put items on this export control classification number. The way this process was intended to work is if an agency or a company identified a technology that posed a national security concern, we put in place a unilateral control on it. One of the highlights of this control is that if the United States was unable to get a multilateral control within 2 years, then that control would go away. We've had some success. Recently, the Nuclear Suppliers Group controlled or placed a control on tritium targets that was subject to a 521 control that was put forward by one of our Department of Energy laboratories. In the past, we've had, for example, a biosensor that was identified in our commodity jurisdiction process. The government determined it wasn't a military item, a dual-use item. We put a unilateral control on it. We couldn't get agreement in the multilateral, the Australia group, and as a result, it went away. So we already have a process in place. Whether this emerging technology process will take the same form, I don't know. But in any event, we do have an existing process. I talked about the effort chaired by our National Security Council. Again, I put this slide up here just to reemphasize that whole of government effort. And certainly that has been a good complement to the effort that is already in place at the Department of Commerce. So this last slide just summarizes my presentation. Some of the challenges that we face with this emerging technology effort. Again, not intended to impede research and development, certainly to take into consideration efforts abroad, and to put controls in place where appropriate slices that are identified to pose a proliferation or national security risks are put into place, and ultimately trying to obtain multilateral controls on those technologies that we identified. So with that, I will close, and I will be here all day. So if you have any questions on this or other challenges that you might face, I'd be happy to discuss.
Thank you, Alex. Our last panelist is Corey Phelps, Compliance Officer from the Sanctions, Compliance and Evaluation Division at the Office of Foreign Assets Control, U.S. Department of Treasury. Corey, please.
Hi, I'm Corey Phelps from OFAC. Pleasure to be with you. So before I start, just by show of hands, has anyone ever actually heard of OFAC in the room? Okay, all right, small, but growing, it's good. So to give you a little bit about a history of OFAC, so my plan is to, one, not put you to sleep, and then two, is to give you some kind of just base level information about OFAC and leave time for the panel. So essentially, we're part of the U.S. Treasury. We're kind of a small agency. It's about 200 people. We're made up of a licensing division, enforcement, compliance, policy, regulatory affairs, Office of Global Targeting. To give you a sense, in my division, we're called the appliance division, which means we engage with the regulated industry, which is usually financial companies, insurance companies. So we do OFAC-related investigations. We reach out to the regulators. We kind of have an ongoing dialogue. And the kind of key thing to remember about OFAC is we're not a regulator ourselves. We're a national security agency. So we don't mandate anything. What we do mandate, though, is that you don't violate our regulations. So what we do is we administer economic sanctions, and that term is kind of used a lot, and it can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. So hopefully my plan is to kind of just give you a brief overview of what that is. And as kind of my colleagues stated, it's tough to be an expert because these things are a dynamic program, right? So there's constant changes, and that's kind of one of the reasons why I didn't make a presentation, is because usually, you spend several hours on these presentations, and this actually happened to me. 3-4 hours, write the presentation, put it on the slides, get on the plane, get off the plane. There's an announcement, there's a new sanctions program based off this. So all the things that I made, that 3 hours is kind of thrown out the window. So I kind of like to, now what I do, I've learned, is just go out and have this dialogue. So that's what kind of my division does. So not only do we do investigations, but we also do outreach. So we've been going more to Europe and then to Asia, just kind of explain what OFAC is, so people have a kind of an understanding. They know they can reach out to us and they can talk, so they can see we're not just kind of, imposing agency. We really do try to have an open dialogue with people so they understand our regulations, and then have that understanding to hopefully, kind of going forward. So we're going to talk quickly, very, very quickly, about where we get our authority from. So what we have is either executive action, or they're called executive orders from the president. He outlines kind of his policy, and we're the sanctions implementers, which means we work with the Commerce Department, BIS, and the State Department, and we kind of implement these sanctions, or this executive order, in a kind of in a comprehensive manner. And we also get our authority from congressional legislation. So Congress, the U.S. Congress has, they might pass certain laws, and then they have sanctions implications. So they will incorporate into our existing regulations. So these type of sanctions can be blocking, prohibited, comprehensive, or secondary. So talking about blocking, what that basically usually applies to is only U.S. persons, meaning if you're a U.S. company, or if you are incorporated in the United States or in a third country but incorporated under U.S. law, if you come in contact with blocked property, which means someone who's on the SDN list, someone that's our specially designated nationals list, and blocked persons list, this is a list that whenever we do sanctions, we designate someone, which means we put them on this list based off this criteria that was listed in the executive order. Then that means they're on our SDN list, which means U.S. persons can't deal with them. So then if a U.S. person does come in contact with their property, they have to block it. So when people oftentimes call us and say, you have our money, we have no one's money. What people do is they block and they reject banks usually. They do these things in reaction to our rules and regulations. So we'll pass a rule or regulation, they'll see it, and then they'll block or reject a transaction based off that rule or regulation. So we ourselves don't have or take possession of your money, but these banks, financial institutions do. So that's what we mean by a blocking sanction. It usually involves people or on the SDN list and or things or entities that they can control 50% or more. It's called our 50% rule, for lack of a better word, which basically means if company A owns company B 50% or more, that company is also blocked because they're majority owned by specially designated national and SDN. So we also have kind of targeted prohibitions. So this has been kind of new and novel in terms of if you're familiar with the Russia sanctions program. So when Russia annexed Crimea, we issued this sanctions program that was kind of new and novel in the sense that it wasn't just blocked persons, it wasn't just a rejection program, comprehensive program, but it was actual targeted prohibitions based off an activity or conduct. So, some of the Russian banks, if they have debt that's for that Russian bank, that would have to be rejected by certain institutions. So that's when we started just to move in these more new and novel sanctions that we've implemented. Obviously, there's kind of a comprehensive sanctions program relating to North Korea, Iran, formerly Sudan, Cuba. So essentially what those are is broad-based prohibitions for U.S. companies or any transactions going through the United States. And then kind of quickly, I should kind of double back and talk about our jurisdiction. So what we try to do is not sanction the world. What we're trying to focus on is our universe. So what that means is our jurisdiction extends to U.S. persons or persons physically located in the United States. So transactions that transit the United States. So that's oftentimes why you see U.S. dollar transactions that transit the United States. Those have U.S. jurisdiction, and that we kind of try to intercept those transactions and make sure that they don't kind of impact our jurisdiction, which is why those have kind of been more and more prevalent. And any U.S. goods or technology. So that's also, we work very, very heavily with the Commerce Department to kind of make sure that the U.S. origin goods or technology kind of don't go to where we don't want it to go. So then I think the other sanctions that are kind of applicable to the people in this room are the secondary sanctions. So this is kind of, it's been recent in the last few years, and what those are is, so what we've mainly been talking about are the primary sanctions. Primary sanctions usually deal with, again, U.S. persons, transactions going through the United States, entities owned or controlled by the United States, possibly in a foreign country. So secondary sanctions is where we move in this realm of, now we start based off certain criteria. We call it a 7-factor test. So if your transaction meets these 7 general factors that we've laid out, then you could be sanctioned if you engage in those 7 factors. So basically, if there is an entity that we put on our SDN list, has a certain tag, and you engage in a transaction that meets these 7 criteria, that could be, that party could be sanctioned itself. So again, we're not we don't like to play, kind of game of gotcha. What we do, and what we really try to do is try to say, okay, here are the 7 factors, everything's on our website, so if you forget anything I say, you can go to our website, you can find out this information. So when we put someone's name on the SDN list, we usually have a certain tag that says, this tag means this. So if you engage in a transaction based off, these kind of 7 factors mentioned, then you could, and they're a party on the SDN list that says subject to secondary sanctions, it means, foreign parties could be subject to U.S. sanctions. So I know I don't have a lot of time to get to the panel discussion. So essentially, for Iran, it's mainly been there's been a lot of kind of movement since the United States left the Joint Plan of Action (JCPOA). So I think everyone's kind of familiar with that. So then we talked about the primary sanctions. So again, those really only apply to U.S. persons, but I think the key thing to remember is for the non-U.S. audience is essentially any transaction that flows to the United States, meaning there's a dollar payment involving, that means it usually has to get cleared through the United States, therefore implicates U.S. jurisdiction, or is a U.S. good that is diverted, meaning we call it re-export, meaning we export it to one country with full knowledge that it will be exported to Iran or North Korea. So then that's what we call re-export. And so again, those are all kind of encompassed in our regulations on the primary sanctions. We talked about secondary sanctions. Again, this is all on our website. There's a certain tag with entities that have been designated to secondary sanctions. So you can go to see the 7-factor test. 7-factor test means if I have a transaction and it meets these 7 factors, and for example, is it a significant transaction? Is it deceptive in nature? Does it have a large impact? Is it a large, $200 million transaction involving a certain party? So all these different factors could get that party who engaged in that transaction designated. We talked about blocked parties, prohibited transactions. Now let's talk about exemptions. So what exemptions are, it means they're exempt from our regulations. I mean, exempt, or could be exempt from our prohibitions. So there's exemptions, and then there's licenses. So there's two types of licenses that OFAC issues. A general license, meaning in our regulations, there's certain, if you're engaging in an activity that meets these qualifications, it's a general license, it basically says you're free to engage in this activity without writing to us and explaining it to us. So it usually applies to U.S. persons, but there are some non-U.S. persons who utilize their general licenses, and they basically, it's kind of a blanket authorization. So if I'm sending certain supplies, medical devices to Iran, then and it meets the qualifications in this general license, then I don't have to call OFAC and I have to explain. I can engage in this activity. I would explain to my bank, here's this general license that I'm utilizing, and you kind of go forth. Another type of authorization, so if you have something that's exempt from the prohibitions, you have something that's a general license, something that's a specific license. Specific license is when we actually write into OFAC and say, I want to do X, Y, Z, and then we license X, Y, Z. So it's a specifically licensed activity. So usually that involves a U.S. party of some sort or U.S. goods or technology. So again, those are the things that you can kind of engage in that could, so otherwise prohibited activity, meaning otherwise you can't do it, but if there's an OFAC license to do it, then you can engage in that activity. So I know I'm running out of time. So very quickly, North Korea, it's kind of the same thing, except for with North Korea, we've seen more deceptive practices, and so we've issued advisories talking about, North Korean flagged our own ships that are carrying North Korea-related goods. So we've really tried to outreach with the international community to say, here are the things that we're interested in, here's the things that we think are prohibited, here's the things you should kind of watch out for. And it's the same type of thing. And it kind of mirrors the evolution of the Iran program as well. And then the only other kind of key thing to remember here is we've also implemented or imposed the possibility of secondary sanctions for foreign financial institutions engaging in certain conduct. And I think I was, enough time to talk about questions, so then we can move on to the panel.
Thank you, Corey. Before I open the floor for questions, I have one question for Corey. Can we know how does the US OFAC sanctions impact a non-sanctioned and non-US company overseas? Say, for example, a Singapore company that imports copper from Iran?
So you're kind of asking, are you wondering about the impacts of it and what's kind of happened recently, or are you more interested?
It's a hypothetical question.
Mm-hmm.
It's just asking how would it impact your sanctions, how would it impact a non-sanctioned and non-US company that is based overseas?
Yes, so recently we had a new, it's kind of I would say an executive order in action relating to the Iran program that targets, so some of our sanctions kind of we've seen what we use in the Russia context that we've kind of adapted elsewhere, meaning we're targeting a certain sector, and one of that sector was the Iranian metals and mining. So, for example, I spoke overseas in Italy over the summer, and they were very interested in these sanctions because, again, a lot of these companies are non-U.S., and they are engaging or working with the Iranians' metals and mine sector, meaning they're importing copper from Iran. So essentially what we were saying is, so we had this recent sanction put in place that kind of targeted Iranians' metals and mine sector, meaning if you are a non-U.S. company engaging in a significant transaction, you could be secondarily sanctioned, meaning if there 7-factor tests. So not to get too technical, there's our regulations, there's something called the IFSR, which is 31 CFR 561, which basically says, it's our Code of Federal Regulations, has all our regulations online, so anyone can see it. This is what we kind of go from. But what it says is these 7 factors. So if you are engaging with the metals and mine company, you're a non-U.S. person in Iran sector, and your transaction meets these 7 factors. So it could be a very large, significant transaction. It could involve deceptive practice, meaning you tried to hide it. It can involve anything, these 7 factors, or the Secretary of Treasury determines that it's a significant transaction, you could be sanctioned yourself. So that's the kind of, it is in a nutshell. Does that kind of explain it for you?
Okay, thank you, Corey.
Yeah.
Now we'll open the floor for questions. Please tell us your name and the organization you're from. First question, please.
Okay, everybody, there we go.
Yes, the gentleman over there, table 5.
Yeah, my name is Umesh. Right, I'm from Texas Instruments. This question is more on US side regarding the emerging technology and the foundation technology. Is there any way or is there any effort that US is making it for the bilateral agreement or the 4 regimes to convince them to include emerging and the foundation technology in their regime of control?
Yes. Yes. One of the things that ECRA requires is that, first of all, we go through the domestic process of identifying slices of technology that the U.S. government has determined may warrant control because it poses a national security or proliferation risk. And then the next step is to try to obtain multilateral controls. So certainly each of the multilateral regimes have emerging technology efforts ongoing, and the ECRA requires us to try to obtain multilateral controls in the appropriate regime, whether it's biotech, Australia Group, nuclear suppliers group.
But that for basically for the items, right? Not for the framework of the strategy, like including as a emerging technology itself.
Yes. One of the challenges, and maybe if I, just to make sure I understand your question, is the challenge of emerging technology is, in many cases, you don't have the thing yet. You've identified the technology, but you don't have that tangible item that could result from that technology. So certainly, it could take the form of just a technology control. The choke point analysis that I mentioned is, are there tangible items that facilitate that emerging technology? Is there a chip, for example, critical to the quantum computer? Is there a component that is critical to that quantum computer? As it relates to foundational technology, in many cases, for example, the United States has a number of unilateral controls for anti-terrorism reasons. Those are our, 999 controls that are restricted to just a small handful of countries. In many cases, those technologies have been decontrolled by the multilateral regimes, so that there would likely be difficulty getting the regimes to recontrol those technologies, which goes to the point that I was trying to make earlier. Maybe, how do we control those? Maybe an end-use control might be more appropriate. Stand by. We're hopeful to have a foundational technology advance notice of proposed rulemaking to get industry comment on the approaches that we're looking at.
Thank you, Alex. Next question, please.
Alvin, over here to your right.
Okay, the gentleman over there.
Hi, my name is Raymond. I'm from DHL Express. My question is for Corey with regard to the SDN list in OFAC. A major issue in this region is that you have a lot of data and names that are not in Romanized form. So you have the traditional Chinese, you have Japanese kanji, you have Korean, you have Thai. How does the US government interpret those names that are not in Romanized form, especially when you translate them? there's no concordance for translation. There's no perfect translation for those names. So how would a company be able to comply in those circumstances?
It's a great question. So we've started to see that there's certain different dialects, and that doesn't really, I guess, lend itself well to an automated universe. So in a lot of companies, what they use is certain software to check a name on a list, and it kind of gets difficult when you have different dialects on that list. So we've been working, so the SDN list is managed by the SDN team, and that team has grown over the last few years. And what we've been working on a lot is kind of what you've been talking about is coming up with different variations to better, I guess, mimic the actual reality of a name. So when we come out with certain different advisories, we put them in different languages now, and then we're working more and more to have those files exported to our so people can download themselves and see those different names and those different lists to see, okay, this name is, you know, is spelled one way in one language but has a different meaning in a different language. So that's something that's been evolving and we're still working on. So I would encourage you, if you have questions, to I didn't put our contact information, but essentially we can talk afterward. We have a kind of a certain mailbox email that you can email and have your questions to us directly, especially about lists, and then we'll pass it on to our SDN team, and they'll kind of work with you directly. So that's something we've been seeing more and more, that we have institutions and people reaching out to us directly to say, okay, I have a question about this name, it means this, is there a format that you can send it to us? Is there something we can download? Kind of what does this mean? So that's something we're engaged in more recently.
Thank you, Corey. Do you have a next question? The lady at table 23.
Who's the other gentleman who's hand up?
Ladies first.
Yes.
And I believe the table 20 will be the last question because we are running out of time.
So Corey, I have a question with regards to OFAC directives. So you have, for the Russian sanctions, certain limits on the days. So if the customer extends beyond that, so how is the company supposed to control?
So it depends on several different things. So if you are an institution, I guess, processing the transaction, and again, a lot of this information is on our website in the form of frequently asked questions for the Russia program, so we can talk afterward too. But so a lot of things a lot of people kind of ask us some of the same questions, and we get them over and over again. So when we hear the question kind of several times, we try to answer it in a public forum, so it kind of benefits everyone. So, but to your question, so if you're an institution processing the transaction, you want to look at the value date of the transaction. So if you get the transaction, you know, it's, I guess, taking a step back to give you more color to her question, she's asking about in the Russia program, there's certain directives that say, okay, you can only extend credit or debt to the institution for 15 days, 30 days, 60 days. So it basically means if you get a transaction and they've had it, meaning it was an extension of credit to that institution for X number of days, then you have to make sure it comes within the prohibition. So for instance, for the Russian, if it's a debt issued to the Russian bank, they can only have it 15 days to process the transaction. So the question basically becomes, well, how do I know and how do I enforce and how do I implement? So we tell, if you're dealing directly with a party, usually it's for non-U.S. parties, it's, and they're engaging in the U.S. Financial institution, we tell them you need to have a conversation with your bank and the Russian entity and say, when I send you the final invoice, I need to receive payment for 15 days. If I don't receive payment for 15 days, then I can't deal with you. So there's several different ways to kind of handle it. Is you can put something in your contract. You can also let your bank know that this transaction is going to be coming in a certain number of days. There's certain different factors, and we'll talk afterward, but that you want to make sure that you implement it so that you know that you don't run afoul of the prohibitions. And a lot of this information is on our website, which hopefully will be helpful.
Thank you, Corey. Gentleman at table 20.
Good morning, panel. My name is Theo. I'm from Akana Technology. My company is developing radar telecommunication system, working with Singapore A-star scientists. It's a totally local Singapore development under strategic goods 3A001. Under the US Commerce Control List also 3A001. And this radar is specifically designed for commercial as well as the defense aircraft. And I read from the BAS one of the sections, small sections, indicating that for this selling of specific sensitive parts to commercial aircraft can sell to the embargo country due to civil aviation safety. Is it true, or maybe I misread somewhere? Thank you.
Again, it all depends. Which country the radar system is, if that's what we're talking about, is being exported to. But certainly, depending on the country, safety of flight is often a consideration for export.
Now the country is Iran, Israel military, and Russia military.
Well, for Iran, everything. Well, first of all, the Department of Treasury has jurisdiction over exports from the United States to Iran for everything subject to the Export Administration regulations, including items that are EAR 99. So, particularly since the withdrawal from the JCPOA, everything requires a Treasury authorization for export from the United States, including re-exports of items that are subject to the regulations require a Treasury authorization. Does that answer your question?
Sorry, I missed a point. It's purely designed in Singapore and manufacturing in Taiwan without US technology and US design and US content, and no de minimis rule applied.
I would just ensure that any exports you have from Singapore is in compliance with Singaporean law.
Thank you, Alex. Sorry, we are running out of time, so I have to close the panel. But don't worry, the panelists will still be around, so we can always catch them during the breaks. Thank you to all the panelists, and over to Scott. Thank you.
Well, might I suggest, sir, that you pull these two aside sometime today and have a long, fruitful conversation. But on a serious note, that's why we're here. Questions like that have may not involve OFAC, may not involve BIS, may not involve Japan or Australia, but you have some of your most profound experts of the Strategic Goods Control Act here in Singapore sitting in this room too. So take the time to pull somebody aside and say, I've got this cool new gizmo that we want to sell. Is it controlled? Well, let's figure that out first. Does it require a special permit under the SGCA or an OFAC license if it involves US technology into a country like Iran? This is the whole purpose and the whole point of putting you guys in this room and bringing these people in from DC and from Japan and from Australia to have this kind of fruitful conversation. I cannot, and I will continue all day long to beat my foot on the ground, take advantage. If you leave here without a question answered, that's not us. That's you not asking it. And I'll even go as far as saying, if you don't get the chance to do it because the lines are, I mean, these guys are gonna get mobbed at break. But my email address will be up during my presentation at the end of the day. Send me the question. I will forward it on to any panelist that was sitting here in this room today. Or if they're not in this room today and it pertains to something like that, like say an ITAR issue for the US, I'll send it to our State Department folks. I will take that and get that question answered for you. That's why we're here. Okay, two bits of housekeeping. Number one, how many people drove? How many people don't want to pay parking? If you don't want to pay parking, over here at the table are parking coupons. Hold on, I have mine. They look like this. Free parking. The second thing is I saw people taking pictures of the presentations. Excuse me, Singapore Customs is going to post all these presentations online, along with, eventually, once they get the editing and everything done, the YouTube. So all of these panels and all of these speakers and everything you're hearing today will be up on YouTube to watch again and again and again. And also, for those of us that are not quite up to the beautiful corner office level, if you want to get your bosses excited about this stuff, have them watch it too. So with that being said, it is now 7 minutes to 11. We are 13 minutes late for our first break, but that's not the problem. The problem is there's some great coffee and some great food out there that need to be eaten. So please help our amazing staff here at the Marriott Tang take care of that so they're not having to throw a lot of food away. We'll call you back at 5 after 11. We'll start the next panel, and I'm starting it at 5 after 11. Thank you very much.